Good evening, everybody. My name is Scott Redford. I'm the Khalili Professor of Islamic Arts at SOAS and one of the conveners of the Islamic Art Circle. It's a great pleasure for us to have the first lecture in a cooperation with the Barakat Trust for Culture and others, whom we will hear about in just a minute. And a great pleasure to have Noura Al Sayeh as our lecturer this evening. But to learn more about our lecturer, let me turn over the podium, as it were, to the director of the Barakat Trust, Saif al-Rashidi. Saif?
Thank you very much, Scott, and thank you everyone for being with us, and thank you, Noura, who was supposed to come to London, but I think one of the silver linings of the Corona cloud is that having online events means that people from different places can all attend them. As Scott mentioned, this is a collaboration between the Islamic Art Circle at SOAS and Converging Paths, which is a partnership between the Barakat Trust and Asia House, and it's sponsored by the Al Trust and the education program of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. We're very happy to be able to host Noura, who is the head of architectural affairs at the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities. She's an architect with a master's degree from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne in Switzerland. She's been working on this fantastic project in Bahrain since 2015. She was the co-curator of the Bahrain Pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2010, which won a Golden Lion, and the deputy commissioner of the Milan Expo, in which Bahrain won a silver medal for the best architecture and landscape. And we are very keen to bring you this talk by Noura as part of this collaboration because it's a really phenomenal project. The Aga Khan Award for Architecture, which this project received, is given every 3 years to a very small number, usually 5 or 6 outstanding projects that somehow serve communities and places in which Muslims have a significant presence. And they range from contemporary architecture to conservation to public space projects. I think one of the things that's remarkable about this project, which won an Aga Khan Award in 2019, is that it combines almost all of the things that the Aga Khan Award looks for in seeking to recognize exemplary projects that others can learn from and can be inspired by. And one of the things that's inspirational about this project is that it's taken place gradually over a long time. It's been led by a government agency, the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities. And unusually for a project that's about a historic environment, it also embraces and welcomes and supports contemporary architecture and design and art. So I'll hand over to Noura, who will tell us all about this award-winning project, which is often written about and often looked to as an example that others can follow. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Saif, for this introduction, and thank you so much for this invitation. I was, of course, very much looking forward to giving this presentation in live, but as you said, Saif, hopefully in this way it reaches a lot more people. So the project I'm talking about today, as Saif introduced, is the Pearling Path. It's a project, a UNESCO registered World Heritage Site that was inscribed on the World Heritage in 2012. And that was developed on the basis of an idea by Her Excellency Sheikh Hamay Al Khalifa, the current president of the Bahrain Authority for Culture and Antiquities. And the premise, the basis of this idea to register and to create the serial nomination was really to have a site in Bahrain that would link the rich heritage of pearling with, the urban fabric that it created, more specifically in Muharraq, which you see here pictured from an aerial view of the 1950s, which was the capital of the pearling economy until the 1930s. Pearling, as you see, is one of the defining cultural factors and cultural identifiers of the island of Bahrain. The economy of pearling has been recorded as far back as the Dilmun civilization. So here you find two artifacts. One on the right is one of the oldest found pierced pearls, which was found in a site in Shakhura in Bahrain. That's 5,000 years old. To be fair and transparent, it's not the oldest pearl. The oldest pearl pierced pearl that was found in an archaeological site in Kuwait, but I'm sure that somewhere in the underworld of Bahrain there is an equally old pierced pearl that's waiting to be found. And to the right you see some jewelry from the Tailus period, so the Hellenistic period of occupation in Bahrain, where you see once again the use in the center of this necklace of pearls. So really the history of Bahrain and pearls is quite in this show sociable. This is a very nice image I like to show from the 1930s of a stack of oysters at the end of the pearling season that were taken in front of one of the pearl traders, which was actually a German company called Wonkhaus that had its headquarters in Bahrain. This looks like an awful lot of oysters, but when you know that the ratio of oysters that you need to find a pearl is 1 to 10,000, this is probably around, let's say, 4 or 5 pearls that were found in a season. So it really shows, you know, the scale of the pearling economy that was taking place. And at the height of the pearling economy, you know, which culminated in the 1920s, 1930s, pearls really had and still continue to have an incredible value. There is a very famous and famed story linked to the headquarters of Cartier in New York, which is quite a beautiful and telling story. The Cartier brothers, who were trading in pearls and diamonds and other jewels, had divided the world in 3. So each brother had taken a continent, and Pierre Cartier, who was responsible for the American continent, had a small store in New York where at the window of the store they had a 2-string pearl necklace. And he noticed that every day a lady would come in the afternoon to walk through the windows and look at this pearl necklace. And day after day she would come by. So being a very astute businessman, he asked his salesman, you know, who is this lady and then why is she coming here every day to look at this necklace? So they told him she's a very rich widow who owns a walk-up townhouse on Madison Avenue. Her husband passed away recently and she loves this necklace, so she comes to look at it every day. And so he tells the salesman, you know, tomorrow when she comes, please invite her in. I would like to speak to her. So she walks in, and Pierre Cartier, being a very, as I said, very good businessman, manages to make a deal with this lady called Maisie Plant to trade her walk-up townhouse on Madison Avenue for this 2-strand pearl of necklace, which goes to show that the townhouse at the time was probably estimated at around $2 million. So it goes to show, you know, the incredible value that these pearls had. And it's good to keep in mind that especially these natural 2-strand pearls of necklace could take up to 50, 70 years for a jeweler and a pearl merchant to assemble, because these pearls needed to be of the same luster, of the same color. They needed to be of the same, you needed to find 2 pearls exactly of the same weight, and you needed to find a gradation to make the correct balance of these pearls. And obviously it was something that depended entirely on nature. Maisie Plant herself did not really make a good deal. At her death, the pearl economy by then had completely collapsed. In Bahrain, this was due to 3 reasons. First of all, the invention of cultured pearls in Japan in 1932, which completely killed and crashed the economy, because at the time there was no technology in place to be able to differentiate between the natural pearls and the cultured pearls. So the natural pearls completely plummeted in value. At the same time, the economic crash and crisis of 1929 happened in the United States, which completely killed the market for luxury goods, and the US being one of the biggest consumers of natural pearls, the demand plummeted. And at the same time, specifically in Bahrain, in 1932 as well, the first oil well was discovered in the south of the country. And so the exploration of oil and the start of the first Babco, the first oil company started. And because the work in the pearling economy was quite harsh, especially for people in the lower echelons of society, the divers, the haulers, and so on, these people immediately transferred somehow to work in more organized systems in the oil economy. So in the 1930s, 1940s, the oiling economy and industry collapsed nearly overnight, to the extent that until recently, until 10, 15 years ago, the pearl merchants of Bahrain were still trading from the stocks that had been left over from the 1930s. Such was the demand. What's really interesting about Muharraq is that the city, as we see it now, this is an aerial view from the 1980s, is a single product economy, which means that everything that you see in this picture was built through the economy of pearls. So something as small and as beautiful as pearls built this whole city, and everything until the 1930s, 40s revolved around the economy of pearling, which makes it, quite unique in the world, and which was one of the outstanding universal values of the site that led to its inscription. This is always a bit of a heart-wrenching picture to show, but this is a picture taken by a French photographer called Bernard Gérard in the 1980s, and it shows to what extent the urban, but also more importantly, architectural fabric of Muharraq was still intact until the 1980s. As you see, this unfortunately did not last up until today. This is an aerial view from 2010, where you can see how reconfigured the historic city of Muharraq now is, and most especially in relation to the sea, the relation of the city to the sea. So like many coastal historic cities, a highway was created around the city, completely cutting off the city from the sea. Land reclamation has taken place. This is something that historically used to happen in Muharraq in a smaller scale, let's see, and that started to happen at a much larger scale from the 1970s and onwards, and completely reconfigured the city. So this is the premise in which the project started, and the idea was, of course, twofold. On the one hand, like we said, to reconnect the local identity of Bahrain with the rich heritage of pearling, and on the second, to have a project that would spearhead and serve as a catalyst for the wider urban regeneration of the city of Muharraq, and an urban regeneration led by the cultural reading and understanding of the pearling economy. So it's quite a unique take on urban regeneration that is led by a cultural and historic regeneration. The project, the map that you see here is the site as it was inscribed on the UNESCO. The project is actually a serial nomination. It was prepared by Dr. Brita Randolph, who had the idea of creating this path through Muharraq that would link 17 properties that you see here to one another, going through the historic quarters of Muharraq and connecting once again the historic coast that you see on the south of the map of Boumaher to the rest of the city. The pearling path itself is not a historic path, so it's not a path that in itself had a historical antecedent. It's a path that's introduced into the city today by connecting these different pathways. And like I said, the idea behind it was to kind of, through this this backbone that goes through the city, start a regeneration process that would eventually lead to the wider urban regeneration of the whole city. So this is as I said, the project started in 2012. And as we can see from the aerial view, a lot of the architectural heritage of Muharraq had unfortunately disappeared by that time. But the urban network of the city, the cityscape, the network of streets, the height of the buildings and so on, had still been relatively preserved and remains up till today one of the best examples of Islamic cities, preserved Islamic cities in the Arabian side of the Gulf. And in that sense, although a lot has been lost, there was still, a core to the city that we believed in, Sheikh Hamay and the team believed could lead to a historic regeneration project. Of course, the challenges on an urban level were manifold. The first of them being that the city had been completely neglected. There had been a lack of maintenance, of upgrade on the buildings, on the urban network. So we needed to catch up with around 30 years of lack of maintenance on the historic core of the city. And actually, one of the main challenges of the project was not so much the architectural conservation of the properties, which we'll get to, but one of the main challenges that we faced at the start of the project was to know through how could we ensure that once the project was complete and implemented, the urban fabric of the city was the same that it was when we inscribed the project, which was, especially in this part of the world, with the very fast pace of urban development, and the many changes that happened, was really not a given. So actually the first, I think, 5 or 6 years of the project, the bulk of the work that was being done was to introduce zoning, building regulations, all the legal framework that would make sure that the historic value of the city would be conserved and maintained and protected as we move through the project. And this is a process that was developed by colleagues of mine, Dr. Ala El-Habashi, Ghassan Shemali, that was doing the urban framework, which really set the premises and made sure that the project was protected beyond just the buildings that were being preserved. And I think this is really, it was a really important part of the project. And unfortunately, in many, in many parts of the Arab world, the part that is often missing and that, in the long term, fails to protect the projects that you're trying to work on. As part of this initiative, one of the largest scopes of the project actually is a project that we call the facade upgrade. So the 400 facades along the 3.5 kilometers of the Purling Path were surveyed by in collaboration with architecture students from the University of Bahrain, who really redrew, in all the minute and let's say boring details, every single facade with every single wire that was going through it, in order to prepare a tender that we actually just waived recently for the upgrade of all these facades along the road. So it was really important for us that the project was not only about monuments, but that it was about the urban fabric, and that we really spread out our attention and the work throughout the city. In addition to that, one of the other first components of the project that we started working on and thinking about was the wayfinding system of the project. And to be honest, we had initially launched a small competition for the wayfinding on the system, because it's a challenging project in the fact that it's actually part of the city. And how do you give an identity to something that's actually wants to be part of the city and doesn't want to necessarily differentiate itself by the city, but wants to highlight a few aspects through it. And so the winning proposal by Bureau Basmet and Office Kirsten Geers, David Van Severen, about 2 Belgian offices, was a very interesting concept where they thought beyond the wayfinding project of the city, that what was more important and more interesting to introduce was to introduce a series of public spaces along this pathway. And these public spaces were built on the site of demolished homes in the city, and it was acknowledging the contemporary needs of the city, saying, this is the situation as it is today. The city needs to also be a city, that can function today. There is a lack of public spaces. There's a lack of green spaces. Let's use the opportunity of these plots that are adjacent to the pathway and that are empty, to develop something that historically was maybe not present, but that will today create new opportunities for the city. And these public squares were really thought of as places of encounter between the local community and the visitors to the pathway. So that there was places where, you know, people could interact, could meet, and could add life to the city. So these are two images from two of the squares that are implemented. And this is a very simple before-after image where you see what these leftover spaces. In Bahraini, we call them baraha, which is basically a barren land that's left open. Actually nearly all cases, they're taken over by cars, because cars are very heavily present in Muharraq and in Bahrain in general. And through the introduction of these spaces, we were able to transform non-spaces, let's say, in the city to spaces that have become places where activities that perhaps had no place to go in the city before are now finding their way. In addition to that, there is a wayfinding system, which is a series of public lights. So it's this actually the street lighting of the Muharraq, which, you know, metaphorically also refers to the pearls that the city is associated with, and that very naturally through which you find your way through the maze of the city by following these lampposts and every now and then arriving on a public square. So you see them here. In addition to that, obviously the main highlight of the project, let's say, are these 17 historic structures and properties that are now registered. And these property, this is, for example, an image before restoration. These projects are now all currently in restoration, so we don't have the after project pictures yet. This was the house of the Fakhro family, who were traders trading in boat building, and they had a fleet of boats that they would take out at sea during the pearling season. And this was their large family house that was actually built on the coast at the time, through which they could see the boats going through. This is the Siyadi Majlis, which is probably the most iconic and architecturally expressive house on the pearling pathway. And that's actually quite telling from a historic and architectural point of view, because it's one of the very few examples in the Gulf of traditional architecture that starts showing signs of wealth through the ornamentation that you see on this facade on the exterior of the house. This was normally always done, you know, according to Islamic traditions and so on the inside of the houses and not on the outside. And this was the house of the Siyadi family, who were very prominent pearl merchants. And this was their majlis, so their public meeting places where they would meet you know, traders from all over the world that were interested in buying their pearls. And it shows, you know, what position and how wealthy these pearl merchants were in the city, that they started showing external signs of wealth in their houses. And the house of the ruler at the time, Sheikh Isa bin Ali, is a few hundred meters from this house. And that house is actually a lot more modestly decorated and ornamented than this house shows. And it shows, you know, once again, the position that these pearl merchants had. This is the inside of this majlis, which is even more exuberantly decorated, and shows, you know, the diversity of trade and influences in the traditional Bahraini architecture. This was probably, we believe, built by Indian craftsmen. There's a lot of similarities with, you know, traditional architecture that you find in parts of India and Persia. But what's maybe notable to know in terms of the architecture are these very specific and ornamental gypsum plasters, which are very specific to Bahrain, and which through their geometry and decoration all, of course, refer to elements from the Quran, elements from the traditional day-to-day life of Bahrain, and that are abstracted, as in the traditions of Islamic art, in these gypsum ornamentations. This is the proposal for the rehabilitation of the Siyadi Majlis, which will host the Pearl Museum of the Pearling Path. So you see to the right of the screen, I don't know if you see my mouse, the small pavilion addition that will be added to the project, that's built on the footprint of an existing part of the house that was that was unfortunately demolished, and this pavilion rebuilds on the footprint of that existing element. This project is developed by Studio Anna Holtrop, and it's the architecture and the expression of the addition is quite interesting, because it's reinterpreting and researching the traditional lime-based plaster finishes that were used in the traditional houses of Bahrain. So the houses were traditionally built out of coral stone that was extracted from the coral reefs in the sea. The sea is quite shallow in Bahrain, so it was quite easy to extract coral stone, and most of the houses, the traditional houses, were built out of this coral stone, over which you can see here layers of lime-based plaster were added. So the new edition reinterprets this the finish of the lime plaster, but shows it in its very rough state. So the lime plaster is normally applied in 3 layers, a filling layer and a base layer, and then a finish layer. And the architecture here uses only the two first layers to show somehow the insides of what these coral stone houses are. And as Saif said, it's true that we have, I don't know if it's a particular approach, but we very much like to differentiate between the new interventions that we build and the historic homes that we try to preserve, and try to make sure that each has its own intrinsic architectural expression, and that when we build something new, we don't build it in a nostalgic way or in a way that mimics the old, but we really also admit that we are building in the 21st century, and that we are hopefully also building something that in 100 years will also be worthy of preservation, and it is also representative of what our society today represents. This is another one of the other larger houses on the path, which is the Murad house, which was another house of one of the prominent pearl merchants. This is their house, not their majlis, as in the Siyadi home. It's one of the largest examples of a residential home in Muharraq, developed over a large courtyard. These are some of the images of the inside of the rooms, where you can see a lot of the passive cooling methods that were used in these traditional homes. This is a badghir, which is an indirect ventilation trap. The rooms were often cross-ventilated, so they were situated in a way that they were able to catch the coastal winds and then circulate them through the homes. And this home is going to be transformed into a small boutique, a small guest house, let's say. It was really important for us in the project, like we said, to make sure that the city is still lively, and we don't contribute or encourage a museum city. So it was important that not all of the properties become museums or exhibition spaces, but that some of the properties also host programs that would add value to the city. In this case, because this was one of the largest remaining residential homes in Muharraq, from the nomination, it was included that it would be a guest house that would give visitors to Muharraq the possibility of experiencing staying in one of those traditional homes. This is the Alawi house, which was the house of a smaller trader, let's say, than the Fakhro family, that was trading in goods related to the pearling economy, but smaller goods. And this house has one of two last remaining wind towers in Muharraq. Unfortunately, from the aerial image that you saw from the 1980s, because a lot of these structures suffered from a lack of maintenance, there was, in the 1980s, 1990s, a program that was called Ayla al-Suqut. So it's translated as structurally unable to be saved, and these wind towers were unfortunately deliberately removed and demolished in the 1980s and 1990s because they were deemed structurally unsafe and a threat and a hazard to the safety of the inhabitants of the city. So today there are only two remaining, one in the Sheikh Isa bin Ali house and the other one in the Alawi house that you see here. And these are images for the interior of the house where you see some of the ornamentations and local decorations. And the peacock was a symbol of prosperity and wealth that you would find a lot in traditional homes in Muharraq, that people, this is also, influenced by Indian and Persian traditions that were very influential in Bahrain, and people would have these peacocks represented in their homes because they thought it would bring them prosperity. And this is one of the last small houses that I wanted to show you. And what I wanted to say is that the houses that were selected as part of the Pearling Path were not necessarily the most beautiful houses or the most architecturally outstanding houses, but they were all selected in relation to the pearling economy. So there is, the House of Traders, Pearl Merchants, there's the small house of a diver, Al Ghos house, which is one of the first houses that you see on the path, Beit al-Nokhada, which is the house of the captain of the boat. This, for example, is the house of Badr Ghulum. Badr Ghulum was one of the very first natural healers. Obviously, the working conditions of the divers and the holers and so on were extremely tough. They would die very young. They had a lot of ear problems. They had lung problems. They were diving without oxygen and without equipment, relying solely on catching their breath. And this was the house of one of the first natural healers who would heal the divers, all of the society, and that his house was on the coast, and he had a garden that you still see the remnants of here, which is quite beautiful, in which he would plant all these medicinal herbs that were used to treat his patients in the small treatment room, which you see here. So this is also now one of the houses that are in conservation. In addition to these historic properties that we've shown, the project between its inscription and its implementation grew and adapted a lot, and grew to accommodate different needs that the city also needed and the project. So, for example, we talked about the squares that were something that was added on to the nomination, that was added on to the project. This is a visitor center at the heart of Muharraq, and near the commercial arteries of the Souk, which you see here in a historic image, which is the main entrance from land and the visitor center of the city, that was conceived as, let's say, a community center where workshops can happen, where the local community could also have an interaction with the project and a daily, day-to-day use of it. The site of the visitor center is quite interesting because it's located on the ruins of Amarat Yusuf Abdul Rahman Fakhro, and Amarat, as you may know, is the name that was used for the local warehouses. So these are structures that you see over here. They were very long structures, and they were quite particular because they were situated on the coast, and they served as the boundary. As the warehouses, the goods would arrive, they would be unloaded in these warehouses that you would see here, and then through that they would find their way into the souk where the goods would then be traded. And although a lot of the Amarat have now, unfortunately, not all of them, but many of them have disappeared, what's interesting is that their footprint in the urban fabric of the city is still quite present, and something that, you know, that's also quite important to preserve and reinforce. So this is the site of the project that I'm showing you now. The site is quite large, and it was actually quite a blessing that such a site was still preserved after all these years and still, you know, was vacant and void. And that it still contained the ruins of the Amara on the site. And the site has the particularity of bridging between, let's say, modern Muharraq, which is all these areas that you see here to the left, that were reclaimed from the 1950s, 1960s onward, and the heart of Muharraq and the two commercial arteries that you see here, the Souk, which run parallel to the coast. And so the proposal for the project, we had actually, our commission was just this part here, a small 800 square meter building, but the architect proposed really a roof canopy that would, first of all, give an urban face to the project and give a project from the Pearling Path at the scale of the city of Muharraq. So it's quite a monumental gesture, as you see here. And that through this roof connect the new part of the city that you see over here to the Souk and the commercial arteries that you see here at the other entrance of the site, through this 7,000 square meter roof that creates a scenography for the ruins of the Amara that you see underneath. And here are images, other images from, this is the visitor center itself, the community space. So you see that it really, you know, has a contemporary expression juxtaposed over the ruins. And I think that the contrast of both really make the architecture and the archaeology of the ruins stand out even more. In addition to the registered properties of the Pearling Path, we've introduced a lot of, let's say, adjacent cultural programs that are maybe not directly linked to the Pearling Path, but that continue the mission of regenerating the city through cultural infrastructure. In this case, this was a small project for a dar, which is, a dar is a small performance space where traditional Fajiri music would be performed. Fajiri music is a very specific type of music to Bahrain. It's a music and dance that was performed, as you see here in this picture, on board the traditional dhow boats during the pearling season to encourage and motivate the divers. And it's a very beautiful music that's influenced very much also by African traditional music, you know, because at the time in Oman and in Bahrain, there was a lot of trade with Zanzibar and Tanzania and the coast of Africa. And so there's musical influences on the boats specifically that found their way to Bahrain. And this was something that was an interesting project to work on. There are several existing dars in the city of Muharraq. They're not very visible in the city because they tend to normally take place in a traditional majlis setting, which is the way this music is being performed when it's not on a boat and transposed in the city. And one of the groups that was performing in Muharraq expressed the wish that they needed an extension to their traditional dar, you know, because they were getting visitors from across the region, and when these visitors came, they didn't have space to accommodate them, and they wanted a larger space and some additional facilities. But as we started talking to them, it became quite apparent that their problem was not so much a functional problem. It was somehow a problem of visibility in the city, that they wanted to be more present, more visible, and have a bigger mark in the landscape of the city. And at the same time, it was a challenging typology of project to start working on, because these traditional songs here, we see them on the boat, but when they happen in a majlis, they happen in a very communal seating that we didn't want to disrupt by introducing, let's say, an auditorium type of setting or something that would change the traditional way that they were seated. So the architects came up with a very interesting idea, which was to rebuild a structure that had the same proportions, you don't see it very well here, as the traditional majlis, but with facades that could completely be opened onto the streetscape. So the whole facade of the building can be completely lifted off like a theater when there's a performance, and the glass facades of the building itself are foldable and completely open up to the streetscape once there is a performance. So you see here one of the images during a public performance where the group, the band, is seated as they would traditionally sit, but the place that they're sitting in completely opens up and becomes one with the street, where the whole street becomes the audience of the city. One of the last projects I wanted to maybe share with you, which is not directly related to Pearling, as you can read here, it's the Bahrain Pavilion at the Expo Milan, which seems a bit odd for me to speak about now, but you will understand why. This was the pavilion that was built for the Universal Expo that happened in 2015 in Milan. That was on the theme of agrarian heritage. So it was a series of 10 fruit gardens native to Bahrain that were built in this open air pavilion where you could go between open and closed spaces. And we had actually initially, we had commissioned this project as a temporary pavilion, you know, built out of lightweight materials that could be easily dismantled and recycled, you know, in order for our participation to be more sustainable. But the most appealing project, and the one that we selected from the competition, was not lightweight or temporary at all. As you can see, it's built out of concrete. But it was the best, you know, the best project. So we thought very early on, once we awarded the project, we asked the architect if it would be possible to dismantle the structure after the 6 months of the expo, ship it to Bahrain and rebuild it. Happens to be in Muharraq, here on a site at the heart of the Pearling Path, right next to the house of Sheikh Isa bin Ali, the ruler of Bahrain at the time of the Pearling era in the 1930s. And actually, by coincidence or serendipity, it just so happened that the pavilion fit exactly in on the footprint of a plot that we owned in the city that was once again that was used as a parking space right next to the historic home of the ruler. And we were able to ship it to Bahrain, rebuild it, and open it as a local botanical garden that's open to everyone, the local community and beyond, and that showcases the agrarian heritage that traditionally, you know, you used to find in farms, but also in Muharraq in residential courtyards where people would grow, you know, fruit trees. They would have livestock and so on. This has, of course, changed now, and it was, you know, it's an agrarian memory in the city that has disappeared that we've now reintroduced in a contemporary way. And it was quite beautiful because when we opened this project at the start, a lot of parents would come with their young children to show them the native fruit trees that you used to find very abundantly in Bahrain, like I said, you know, in their courtyards and farms, that due to the very rapid urban development have somewhat disappeared. And this younger generations of Bahraini do not connect with this agrarian heritage. And maybe the last project, sorry, I share with you is a small project that I actually designed myself in collaboration with the architect Leopold Banchini, which was a small house that was supposed to display the architectural heritage of Muharraq. It's part of the Sheikh Ibrahim bin Mohammed Al Khalifa Center for Culture and Research. And the idea behind it was to have a building that would display the traditional architecture of Bahrain and of Muharraq. And obviously this was quite challenging, because how do you build something that's supposed to display traditional architecture without rebuilding traditional architecture, which would not be authentic or original. The side of the project was quite interesting, because it was a very narrow parcel of land that had two structures on either side that you would see. And when we first came to see the plot, it was really beautiful, because there were remnants of all these old walls of the adjacent properties. And there were parts of old coral stone walls that you see here, blockwork walls from the 1960s, walls that were, spray painted in cement finish as they did in the 1970s. And we realized that actually, these walls were actually the best exhibition you could have on the evolution of traditional architecture in the city. And that instead of making a building that you would then include content in, that these walls were actually the most beautiful thing to show. And it was a kind of X-ray through the city, through which you would be able to see all the adjacent walls of the building. So the project is conceived somehow like a bridge structure that spans both sides of the road, and that has a completely openable facade where basically you're kind of becoming one with the buildings around, because traditionally you would have built a wall against the old walls, and these walls would have disappeared. And it was also important that you could completely open up the project to the street, to have a more direct interaction with the local community when there were public exhibitions and so on, where the plot somehow completely disappears and becomes an urban passage within the city. So I think this is it from my side. I don't know if there are, I think that we have some time for some questions that we could receive through the chat. I think Scott is gonna moderate this part. Sorry, did I end a bit abruptly all of a sudden? I thought that I had.
No, this is fine. Please, yes, if you have questions for this about this fascinating project, please write them in the chat box. While we're waiting for some messages to come in, allow me, you can hear me, right, Noura?
I can hear you, yeah.
I hope other people can as well. Allow me to ask you a question I'm sure you have been asked before. And I ask this question knowing that this project is still in the process of implementation, right? The audience for it is a combination, presumably, of Bahrainis interested in their history and also interested in attracting people from outside of Bahrain to learn about it. I don't want to use the word gentrification, but when I see the juxtaposition of some of your beautiful houses and restored things with the structures around, I'm wondering, in the name of reconnecting with their heritage, are some Bahrainis, old families, looking back to their heritage and thinking of moving into this area and themselves restoring old structures? Is there any movement in this direction?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. It's starting, there are signs of it, but obviously when you work on such a project, the challenge of avoiding gentrification to a certain degree is always omnipresent, and that's the reason why it was so important at the start of the project to make sure that we had the building regulations, the zoning, and the legal framework in order to be able to protect this, because we knew that it had happened in other areas in Bahrain, where in the absence of this legal framework, within a matter of 10 years, an area that was traditional completely transformed, and there was hardly anything of the original fabric remaining. So that was one of the reasons it was really important at the start to focus on this. Obviously, a bit of the idea is also that we're not the only actors in the city, that the what we're doing spreads, further and becomes, a more collective effort where, like you said, people that have a house, renovate it and so on. This is starting. We're starting to see it. It's, for us, it's also what makes the project exciting, but it's difficult to gauge what shape this will be, because there's not many examples in the region to compare with. We always wonder, will people start moving back into these historic structures, which would be great. We have a project that we're developing with the Ministry of Housing, actually, and this is a project that my colleague Ala was very much involved and instrumental in. So there was, there's a housing scheme in Bahrain where you can apply to get social housing. And, very often you're moved, let's say, to a new part of town where there's a housing project. And so we tried to work with the Ministry of Housing for people that were living in Muharraq still in traditional homes, or in any home, actually, in the historic city, that if they were applying for a housing project, that we would offer to renovate and extend to a certain degree their home, so that they would stay where they are. So there's many facets to it. On the other hand, one of the things that we were also very careful to do was not to expropriate any of the houses or purchase any of the houses that we didn't need to. So in many of these houses, the Fakhro house, for example, that I showed you, or the Murad house, the houses are actually still owned by the families. We have agreements with them that we will restore the houses, and that they would then, in the case of the guest house, for example, the family will operate it. In the case of the Fakhro house, it remains their family home, but there are 2-3 rooms that will be open to the public. So for us, it was from our side really important that these ancestral family links with the city were not disrupted by a government effort that would, buy out all the houses or, expropriate large parts of the city. It's also the reason why the project has taken such a long time to implement. It's the same case for this facade upgrade, these 400 houses along the homes. We had to sign specific agreements with each house owner that, we would do this part of the house, that they would, so it's, but, there's no shortcut to these things in a way, because once you do, the link that you cut is nearly impossible to reestablish.
Well, this is fascinating. I have many, many more questions to ask, but of course, you have just delivered a wonderfully syncretic as well as fascinating lecture and presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat box. Any more questions?
Scott, there are 3.
Okay, I don't see them. Would you read them out, Rosalind, then?
From Anthony Wynn, you mentioned that artificial pearls were invented by the Japanese in the 30s, but I've just read the account of a traveller to Bahrain in 1896 who mentions Hindu pearl traders mixing artificial pearls from Paris with the real ones. Can you tell us anything about the pearls from Paris at that time?
So there were several attempts to make artificial pearls. The Japanese were not the first. It was something that many people were trying to do, obviously. The Japanese, Mikimoto, to be more precise, were the first that were able to do it successfully at an industrial level, and that were able to do them to a degree that it flooded the markets with such a level that it was no longer, they were no longer able to differentiate between the few artificial ones and the natural ones. But it was something that many people had been trying to do at smaller scales for a long time, obviously, because there was a lot of gain to be made out of it.
And then we got, thank you for an interesting talk. I spent several months in Bahrain in 2017 and visited the Pearling Path so far as it was open at that time. My question is, do you intend to link the Bu Maher Fort to the Pearling Path, as this will be an extra opportunity for visitors?
It's actually just linked. So we have a pedestrian bridge. I didn't mention it or show it. That we're inaugurating in the coming weeks. It's completed actually, and that was, I mentioned it briefly maybe at the start of the presentation. It was a really important component of the project because it reestablishes the pedestrian connection between the city of Muharraq and the Bu Maher Fort. And the Bu Maher Fort is actually, the coastline in front of it is the only remaining natural coastline in the island of Muharraq today. And that was the historic coastline from which the pearling expeditions and fleets would leave on their 3-month pearling dives in the summer.
Great. And then what happened to the byproduct of pearling, the oysters? Are the people of Bahrain a nation of oyster eaters?
No, I mean, there was some superstition amongst the pearl divers that in order to make better pearls, once you opened up the oysters, you needed to throw them back out at sea. So that's a lot of what happened. There's the fishermen and divers would eat the oysters sometimes. It's not, but the Gulf is one of the warmest seas in the world, and I mean it's warming even more. And good oysters need really cold, fresh water, so they're also
dangerous.
I mean, they're not the best tasting oysters. I think they produce much better pearls than flesh. They're also not used for mother of pearl because the Pinctata radiata, which is the oyster that produces most of the pearls in Bahrain, they're not very big oysters, so they actually don't contain a lot of mother of pearl.
Right, and I think probably we've got time for one short question. To what extent has this project worked to engage local organisations, architects, schools, etc., and what are the plans for public engagement?
I mean, like I mentioned with the facade upgrade, throughout the project, we've been working with volunteers and young architects in collaboration with the University of Bahrain, the architecture department. So most of the team I work with today are all young people that had first started training with us, either surveying or doing learning to do conservation, and are now employed by the project. So we try as much as we can. They're also now encouraged again, which I hope will take place, to reintroduce a course on conservation architecture at the University of Bahrain, because it's a skill that's much needed locally. And there's still, not only in Muharraq, but also in Manama and other parts of Bahrain, a tremendous amount of historical properties that are in need of these skills.
Right, I'll return you to Scott, but thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes. There are a couple of more questions, but as Rosalind says, I think we don't want to wear you out. After all, in Bahrain, it's much later than it is here. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I wish you could hear the applause that's coming over.
Thanks a lot for the invitation.
That was really wonderful. Thanks again, very much.
Thanks a lot, Scott. Thanks for the invitation. Bye.
Thank you.